The format of tonight's session will start with our team providing an overview of the rate study, followed by a question and answer session. Next slide, please. To submit a question, please locate the chat button on the bottom of your screen, open the feature by clicking on it, then type your question into the chat window. Our panelists will answer questions following the presentation. Next slide. I would like to take a moment to introduce tonight's subject matter experts. With Reftelis Financial is Steve Gagnon, Project Manager. Steve has over 22 years of water and sewer rate setting experience, in particular in the Orange County and surrounding areas. Steve was responsible for managing and completing the rate study we will be discussing tonight. Steve Miter, Public Works Director. Steve also served as the city's rate study project executive. He comes to us with over 32 years of municipal water, wastewater, and engineering experience. Joining our two Steves tonight for our Q&A session is the city's finance director, Kelly Telford, and from our city attorney's office, Tricia Ortiz, who specializes in public finance law. At this time, I would like to turn this over to Steve Miter to start the presentation. Steve?
Thank you, Iris. For tonight's agenda, the presentation is broken down into 4 sections. I will be presenting the first set of slides on why these proposed rate adjustments are needed, and Steve Gagnon will be presenting the remaining slides more specific to the findings and recommendations from the final rate study report. However, before I start, I thought it would be helpful to give a brief background regarding this water and sewer rate study effort. In November of 2019, Reftelis Financial Consultants was retained by the city to prepare a comprehensive water, sewer, and sewer rate study, which was to include developing 5-year financial plans, cost of service analyses, and design of new structures for both enterprise funds. The results and recommendations from these analyses have been compiled into a water and wastewater rate study final report, which is currently posted on our city's home webpage. Tonight, I will be presenting an overview of this rate effort. Next slide. The first section is why adjust water and sewer rates. Next slide. So why adjust water rates? First of all, the city has not completed a water rate study in over 11 years. And the last time water rates were raised was over 7 years ago. Also, over the course of this last 7 years, the cost to operate and maintain a water system has continued to increase, such as labor costs, water production, chemical costs, energy costs, and of course, the cost to repair and replace infrastructure. There's also a critical need to invest in our water system aging infrastructure, which we'll go into a little bit later. On average, an average of $3.3 million per year will be needed for the water capital projects planned for the next 5 years. And finally, the rate structure needs to be revised to follow today's textbook principles to improve equity among the ratepayers. Next slide. The orange line on this graph shows the increase in CPI over the past 20 years. There's also a CPI for water, sewer, and trash. And as you can see, the CPI has been rising much faster than the CPI for other goods. The gap that existed in 2010 when the last rate study was completed is much smaller than the gap that exists today when you compare this consumer CPI and the water and sewer and trash CPI today. One of the major reasons for this is the challenge of failing infrastructure for the utility companies and needing to invest money in that. Next slide. Water purchases are the single largest cost within the city's water utility. The city buys water from 2 sources: imported water from municipal water districts of Orange County, or MODOC, as we like to say, which is the green line on the upper green line on the graph. And Orange County Water District, which is shown in blue as a blue line. For Orange County Water District, the city pays a fee to access groundwater through the city's wells, and this line represents the fee per acre foot pumped. As you can see, both rates are going up each year, and the cost of purchasing imported water from MoDOC is 2.5 times more expensive than groundwater pumping from the city wells. Therefore, it's imperative to maximize the use of groundwater through the city's wells and minimize the use of more expensive imported water. Next slide. This chart shows the city's annual demand and assumes groundwater pumping from the city's wells is utilized to the maximum extent allowable. The total price to supply the city's annual average water demand in 2014 was $1.85 million. This same quantity of water in 2020 now costs $2.55 million. This is a 37% increase just in the cost of water. And these costs are expected to increase in the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. One of the main drivers for the need to raise water rates is to fund critical capital infrastructure projects. These next few slides will highlight the needed capital improvements planned to start within the next 5 years. This slide shows the city's 3 active supply wells, which all need major capital improvements to continue using them. So we'll start from the top. Bolsa Chica supply well, put in service in 1977. It's quickly coming up to its useful life. So a major improvement is needed. The budget to perform this is $2.3 million. Beverly Manor Pump Station and water supply well has arguably reached its useful life, and the cost for this is about $4.7 million. In Lamson Well, our newest well was initially constructed to back up the 2 older wells back in 2011. However, as a result of natural occurring odor issues within the groundwater at this location, the well is not able to supply the intended pumping output. To bring the supply well to the full capacity, a treatment plant needs to be constructed to remove the odor to ensure full water supply delivery capabilities. So the takeaway here is the 3 city wells need improvement to ensure the city can maximize groundwater use to keep supply costs to an absolute minimum. Currently, should one of these wells go down, we have no ability to make up the difference, and we've had to go out and purchase more expensive met water, which in turn would hit our bottom line very hard. Next slide. This slide shows the piping network for the city's water system. The transmission mains, which bring water into the city, are shown in blue, and the distribution mains, which take water to the end users, are shown in light green. Overall, the piping network is in fair condition. However, there are critical projects that need to be completed within the 5-year planning window. One critical project is the improvement of a transmission main that runs through Los Cerritos wetlands. It has reached the end of its service life and must be replaced within the next few years. Also, off to the right, you'll see a slide an aerial slide of Old Town 100 years ago. As you can see, the streets and alley grid were in place at this time, thus the water lines were in place. The good news is a majority of these distribution mains have been replaced over the decades. But it appears the most difficult section has been saved for last. So we currently have roughly 1 mile of 100-year-old pipe in service. And of course, we have to address that within the next 5 years. Next slide. So again, this just shows the projects broken down into the transmission mains, distribution mains, and we'll talk about the water meter project at the end of the slide. So transmission mains, we spoke about the need to replace, we have $2.4 million, $2.5 million allocated for transmission main replacement, including the Los Cerritos transmission main. For distribution piping network, we have $1.5 million budgeted for the 5 years, and that includes replacement of the 100-year-old pipe sections. And for the water meter project, the city's average age of water meters combined is about 25 years. And this is well beyond the recommended service life of a meter. And what happens as meters get old, they start to slow down. Ultimately, they stop. So it's important that we budget this project and start working on replacement over the next 5 years. To replace these aging meters, an advanced meter infrastructure project is proposed. This state-of-the-art AMI technology, sometimes referred to as smart meters, allows customers to access their water usage in real time to better assist their efforts to conserve water. For example, should a customer, the city currently reads meters every 60 days. So let's say your toilet starts to leak right after the meter is read. A customer would only learn of this leak after they receive a higher than normal water bill 60 days later. With smart meters, a customer can learn of this leak much more quickly and manage the leak accordingly. Next slide. So summary, current revenues do not pay for increase in O&M cost. There's a critical need to fund capital infrastructure investment. And there's a need to implement a more equitable rate structure. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about why adjust sewer rates. The Sewer Enterprise Fund presents a completely different set of circumstances compared to the Water Enterprise Fund. The city's last rate study was completed and implemented in 2005. The main goal of the 2005 study was to significantly increase rates over a 12-year period to build reserves up to fund failing wastewater sewer infrastructure. The sewer system infrastructure funding goals are now met, with the needed capital projects either have been completed or they're currently funded. In addition, the wastewater reserves are currently very healthy. Therefore, the 5-year financial plan analysis shows that the sewer fund revenue requires it can be reduced. And finally, the proposed sewer rate reduction presents an opportunity to implement a more fair and equitable rate structure that is consistent with current Proposition 218 interpretations and requirements. At this point, I'm going to hand the slide over to Steve Gagnon, and he'll go through the details of the rate study. Steve?
Yep. Thank you, Steve. If we could move on to the next slide. And the next slide. First, I'm going to talk about the Water Enterprise financial health. And in this slide, it shows two graphs if the city were to not adjust water rates at all. And the top graph shows, you can see stacked bars, and you see a dark line going across the stacked bars. And the stacked bars represent your expenses. So you can see the green are your operating expenses, and the blue is your rate-funded capital, all those projects that Steve Miter just discussed, all the meters and the transmission mains and so on. That's all, the cost of that is shown in the blue part of the stacked bar. And the line is your revenue. So you can see, what you can conclude by looking at the top graph is that if the city executes all the projects as it hopes to, then your costs are greater than your revenue, because the stacked bar is higher than the line. So what happens, obviously, when you have more costs than you do revenue, is you start to use your reserves. And that's what's shown in the bottom graph, is if you don't adjust rates and you do complete the capital projects that the city is hoping to complete, then you dip into reserves. You not only dip into reserves, but you go negative. And that's what's shown in the bottom graph, is by the end of the study, we show you have a negative balance of nearly $14 million if you were to execute all the projects that Steve mentioned. And it's worth mentioning that the city had a CIP that we reduced to meet these revenue adjustments. So the city has had to cut back substantially on the number of projects that they would like to execute. Next slide, please. So what we're proposing here are revenue increases. And the bottom table here shows the percent revenue increases in each fiscal year. So we're saying in May of 2021, we would set rates so that the revenue, the city's water revenue, would go up 14%. And then 12% the following fiscal year, and 9 and 8 and 8 and so on. This also assumes $11 million in capital financing through different ways. There could be SRF loans, there could be traditional loans or other sources, but it does assume $11 million through some type of loan or capital finance. Next slide, please. So this shows the financial plan with the proposed rate changes. So you're looking at the same two graphs that you just looked at, but now you've got the adjusted rate revenue. So going back to the top graph, there's a new line there. It's the dotted line. And that is the projected revenue with these rate adjustments. And as you can see, except for fiscal year, the first two fiscal years, for at least 2 years, your costs are roughly in line with your revenue. But there are a couple of years, 21, 22, and 25, where your costs outstrip your revenue. And so that reduces your reserves, as shown in the bottom graph. And I think the most important thing that I want to point out here in the bottom graph is you see two lines. You see a dashed, I'll call it teal line, and you see a dark line. The dashed teal line is the minimum operating reserve goal. It's sometimes accountants call it working capital. It is a reserve the city has to have to pay its monthly expenses, things like salaries, utilities, chemicals, supplies. It is very common for an agency or a water utility to hold some money, some working capital in reserve. And that's normally, for most water agencies, it's 3 months worth of working capital. So in other words, if something were to happen and they were to stop receiving revenue, they could still pay bills for 3 months. That's another way of thinking of it. And that is the minimum industry standard for reserves. And as you can see, on the right of this graph, at the end of this 5-year period, we're projecting that the city would roughly only meet that reserve target, the working capital reserve target. Ideally, the city should also have a capital reserve target, and that's shown in the dark line. Okay, so the dark line is the sum of the O&M reserve target and the capital reserve target. So as the city issues these large $1 million contracts to repair pipes and pumps and wells, it is standard industry practice to have some money in reserve to pay for those contracts. The city doesn't want to issue a contract for $1 million and then hope that it'll collect customer revenue and turn around and pay the contractor. It should hold some money in reserve to pay for those contracts. It's called a capital reserve. So if you add those two together, ideally, the city would hit that dark line. But as you can see, it's not. So this was a conscious decision by the city and city staff to minimize customer bills. Okay, so ideally, they would be increasing rates more to hit the dark line, but they're making a decision to keep rates low and keep reserves at a minimum. I want to point this out because it could be crucial in discussions further on down the line. So that's this slide. We can move on to the next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk about the water rates. Next slide, please. And the next click, please. So this is your current water rate structure. Right now, the city charges a capital fund fixed charge that depends on each customer's meter size. And for most single family customers, that's the 5/8 or 3/4 inch meter at the top of this box. Next click, please. And then for single family customers, the rate is shown in blue. There's 2 tiers. And if you use under 26, it's $223. and then $2.88 for anything beyond that. Next click, please. All other customers pay the rates as shown, and it depends on the meter size. So you can see here in the green table, there's different meter sizes, 4-inch, 6-inch, 8-inch. And there's different tiers, and the amount of water in each tier is different, but you can see the rates are the same. So that's the rates for commercial customers. Next click, please. And then Leisure World has a fixed charge and a volumetric rate. Next click. And then the city also has a volumetric rate for its water use. So that's the current water rate structure. Next slide, please. And this is the proposed water rate structure. So a fixed charge would remain by meter size, as shown in the left box there. And next click, please. And then in blue, you can see that this would be all the residential customers, which is single family, multifamily, and Leisure World as well. We're treating Leisure World as though they are multifamily because it is essentially a large multifamily complex. So residential rates would be shown in blue, and then commercial rates, or I should say all other customers, commercial, irrigation, city, aquatic park, and so on, their rates would be shown in green. And those rates are proportional to how they use water. So if a particular class, you can see irrigation there has a slightly higher rate than the other rates. That's based, this is not arbitrary, that's based on how they use water. The irrigation customers tend to have higher peaking demands during the summer, and that's reflected in their rate. It's a lot like electricity. You pay more when you use electricity on a hot August day. Well, if you peak more, you pay a little more. So next slide, please. For the sake of completeness here, we're showing you the proposed fixed charge for the next 5 years in the top table. And then in the bottom, it shows the private fire charges. This doesn't apply to any single family customers. This only applies to mostly commercial, maybe some multifamily accounts who have private fire standpipes out in front of their building. So it doesn't apply to most single family residences. Next slide, please. And then this is the volumetric rate that I showed earlier for the next 5 years. Okay, next slide, please. Now we're going to do the same set of slides, but it's going to be for the sewer enterprise. Next slide, please. And so this slide shows the financial plan for the sewer system without rate adjustments. And you can see, except in the top graph, there are at least 2 years where revenue equals expenses. And you can see in the bottom graph that the sewer system has healthy reserves, especially at the 5th year. The target is the black line, and the reserves are above target, meaning the sewer enterprise is in good financial health. So what the city is proposing, in the next slide, please. The city is proposing to actually decrease sewer revenue. So there would be a one-time decrease in fiscal year 2021 of about 25%. So that means we would set rates so that overall the city decreases the amount of revenue they collect. And then after that, it would stay, you could say, stagnant for the next 5 years. So there's a one-time 25% decrease. And this is not common at all. As you can imagine, most cost goes up. I don't know of many goods that go down in price. So I've been doing this for quite a few years in Southern California, and I can count on one hand how many times this has happened. So this is not a common occurrence, but Seal Beach has the luxury of having a healthy sewer enterprise, and therefore this is what the city is proposing. Next slide, please. And so this shows with that decrease in revenue, you can see those reserves are going down with time. And at the 5th year of the study, you can see that reserve is much closer to the black line or the target. Okay, so another way of putting this is the city is buying down its rates with reserves. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk about the sewer rate changes. Next slide, please. So the city has a fairly complex sewer rate structure. The sewer charge, a customer's sewer bill is based on the water bill. It takes 22% of the water bill and then adds a sewer capital charge. And you can see the sewer capital charge is shown in the box on the right. You can see the bigger a meter size you have, the more you pay. And 75% of the current sewer revenue comes from this sewer capital charge. So the city is, in essence, is billing customers in proportion to meter size, which is an estimate of potential water use. And next click, please. And what we're proposing is a more equitable rate structure in which the industry is moving in this direction. The industry is moving away from using meter size to charge for sewer rates, and it's basing its rates on an estimate of sewer use based on water use. Okay, so each customer class uses water, and we make estimates the best we can to estimate how much of that water goes back down the sewer and doesn't end up on the lawn. Because if it ends up on the lawn or on a car, it may not go back to the sewer. So we make estimates based on water use to come up with a sewer charge. Next slide, please. And so this is what we propose. The box on the left there shows what a single family customer would pay in the first year anyway. Each single family customer would pay $48 and change. And right now the average customer is paying about $59 in change. And then on the right, you have the rates for each other customer class. So all these other customer classes, multifamily, commercial, city, they would pay $1.22 for a billing charge. And then after that, they would pay $4 per HCF for each 100. HCF stands for 100 cubic feet, and 100 cubic feet is equal to 748 gallons. So those customers would pay $4 for every 748 gallons they discharge to the sewer. Next slide, please. And then why don't you go to the next click too, please? Leisure World currently does not pay for sewer because for the most part, they have their own sewer system on Leisure World. But that sewer system connects to a section of pipe that is city owned. And that section of pipe brings Leisure World's sewage to the Orange County Water District. And right now they're not paying for that. So we're proposing a charge to cover the cost to operate and maintain that section of pipe. And this is how it was calculated. Why don't you do the next click, please? We took the capital cost of the pipe divided by the expected life. Staff estimated the annual O&M. We added that. And lastly, that pipe is used mostly by Leisure World, but 5% does come from other entities outside of Leisure World. So with that, it comes out to $1,100. I'm going to round $1,100 for a monthly charge for Leisure World. And this is not dependent on how much they use. It's just to cover that pipe that is near or under the 405. And it's $1,000 to maintain and repair that section of pipe every month. Okay, next slide, please. And then again, for the sake of completeness here, we're showing you the charges for each customer class. Single family, as you can see, would pay $48. And then you can see these charges are stagnant for the next 5 years. This, again, is something that is not terribly common. Costs for things go up every year. And so the city is proposing to leave rates stagnant for the next 5 years. First, actually, there'll be a decrease, and then the rates will stay stagnant for 5 years. Next slide, please. And so lastly, we're going to show you how customer bills will be impacted. And we've added both to simplify things, we've added both water and sewer bills together to show you the net impact. So next slide, please. And before we get into the numbers, here's the takeaway, is that essentially water rates and bills will go up because remember the revenue adjustments we showed you. Sewer rates and bills will go down. So the net of that is, it should be that single family residential customers, the way we modeled it is we took water use from the past year and modeled customers' bills. So if everyone uses water like they did last year, then the total bill for single family customers should either stay the same or go down. Next slide, please. So here is the single family residential bill impact for water and sewer. And what this shows is a frequency distribution, and you can see the bulk of your single family customers are in that 67% orange bar there. So most customers will either see no change to their bill or have a small decrease of up to $5. And then if you're a low water user, you can see there's 16%, 5%, 9%. You can see some customers are going to get more than a $5 decrease in their bill. So really, how your bill is affected depends on how much water you use. For a typical house, your bill should stay about the same. If you're a low water use house, then your bill should go down a little bit. Next slide, please. This slide shows an average single family customer. So the average single family customer right now pays $130 per billing cycle. This, with these changes, it would go down to about $125 per billing cycle. So the difference is a decrease of not quite $6. And this is for the average single family home. Of course, if you're not average, if you use more or if you use less, it's going to vary from this. Next slide, please. This shows the bill impacts for multifamily residential. And I discussed earlier how the city is essentially going from charging in proportion to meter size to water use. That's a notable change in how you bill. So therefore, multifamily, with its large variation in water use, it's no surprise that this distribution here is more varied. But you can see 23% of multifamily customers will see anywhere from no change. I'm looking at the tallest bar right now, the one that says 23%. At the bottom of that, it says no change up to $25 in change, in your bill change. And then after that, it varies. You can see some multifamily customers go down and some customers go up. Next slide, please. This shows the impact on commercial customers. And you can see there's a good chunk of customers with the 48% there that will see anywhere from no change to a decrease of about $100. And if you add the 48 to the 17 to the 2 to the 1, you should get around 68%. So 68% of commercial customers should see some either no change or some form of decrease in their total bills. Next slide, please. Lastly, we have Leisure World, and this shows the increase for Leisure World. The average water bill, or the average water increase, I should say, for Leisure World will be about $16,000. And of course, that varies, okay? If they use less or they use more, it's going to be more or less than that. And then we're implementing the new fixed sewer charge for Leisure World. And when you add those two together, on average, it's going to be an increase of $17,000 in change for Leisure World. There's about 6,600 dwellings on Leisure World, so that equates to a $2.61 increase per dwelling, per apartment at Leisure World. And I just want to state again that we're treating Leisure World just like multifamily. So we're not treating them any differently. And then of course we are adding that fixed sewer charge because they currently aren't paying, and there is a cost to maintain and replace that section of pipe. And therefore we feel that they should be charged, because if they don't pay for that, then somebody else is going to pay for that. So we feel it's equitable to have Leisure World pay for the fixed sewer charge for that section of pipe. Next slide, please. So to summarize everything that we went through, water rate increases are needed to pay for all the capital projects and well and reinvestment that Steve Miter described earlier. Sewer rates are going down due to healthy reserves. And overall, if everyone uses water like they did last year for your typical single-family home, I usually don't deliver this news, but it means mostly good news, because bills are staying the same or they'll go down. And that concludes our presentation. I'll turn it back over to you, either Iris or Steve, to finish it up.
Well, thank you, Steve. This concludes the presentation, and now we will start our question and answer session. As a reminder, please submit your questions by opening the chat feature by clicking on the chat button located at the bottom of the window. So we're going to start off with our first question here from Dominic Massetti. 30% of the rate increase is to support $7 million in capital improvements not being financed, along with the additional $9 million that is being financed by debt. Why not finance all of these capital improvements by debt, since rates are at an all-time low now and probably much lower than the 4.5% assumed in the rate study?
I assume I'll take that one. So essentially, it's because the city does not have unlimited borrowing capacity. When the city enters into a debt agreement or a debt contract with a debtor, it has to meet certain stipulations. And one of those stipulations is a debt coverage ratio. And our calculations show that the city was getting somewhat close. The minimum debt coverage ratio is 1.25, and the city was hovering around 1.29. So you probably want to have a little bit of a buffer there. So we think the city is nearing its debt capacity, and it doesn't have an unlimited ability to borrow and borrow.
Okay, thank you. Our next question from David Phillips regarding sewer. You didn't discuss OCSD treatment charges. What are they? Does Leisure World pay OCSD for treatment separately?
I'd have to, so I believe, yeah, why don't you take that one, Steve?
Steve, this is Steve Miter.
Yeah.
Seal Beach, we only provide collection, in that property owners are it's going to be on their property tax bill for Orange County Sanitation District, which provides treatment. So our responsibility is collection only. And I think that answers the question.
Yeah, I could probably help expand on that just a little bit. If homeowners are to look at their property tax bills, they'll see a line specific to Orange County Sanitation District. We only collect for the collection fee, where the treatment fees are on each property owner's property tax bills.
We have a question from Terry Parton. Where did the 17 HCF average usage come from?
We got a data dump of water use from the city, and we took the average use. I don't remember where we didn't put that in the presentation, but it does ring a bell in the sense that 17 HCF, that must be bi-monthly. but if it's in our report, then we got it from city provided data. We take the average use. Or is that single family or multifamily? I don't know. But I will say that 17 HCF was a fairly average use for single family homes a few years back. It should be lower than that. So if we did state that as an average use somewhere, we got it from the city.
And we just received another question from Dominic Massetti. A silently leaking toilet can waste 20 gallons a day. That's over 7,000 gallons per year. Leak detection tablets are a highly potent dye tablet for use in easily detecting toilet flapper leaks. These packets are available for about 10 cents each, so why not offer them for free to any household who wants to use them as a way to help them find ways to reduce their water?
I'll take that question. I think that's an excellent suggestion, and we will definitely look into that in terms of marketing and making sure that's available to our customers. Thank you for the suggestion.
Question from David Phillips. Regarding sewer, is there a condition assessment, CCTV I presume, of all town sewers that is less than 10 years old?
We do keep a video log of our CCTV inspections. I believe we have a complete log of all the pipes in the last 10 years. So yes.
Question from Carrie Parton. What does the 10-year wastewater CIP look like?
We have that at the beginning of the presentation. I don't think we did, but if I'll get into the model and I can tell you, I assume the question is how much is being spent over the next 10 years. And I can answer that if you give me a moment. CIP. Okay, if I add up, let me just make sure I got funded capital. Okay, so I'm going to add up 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, it looks like it's about a little more than $14 million.
We have a comment come in from Mr. David Phillips regarding sewer. Having zero capital element in sewer charges may set a bad precedent and be looked back on in 2025 as a political mistake.
Well, the rates do collect capital costs. So there is a capital element in the rates. It's just that they're not in proportion to meter size. Remember, I said earlier that the industry is moving away for charging sewer charges. They're moving away from meter size as a proxy because meter size is not a fantastic link to how much water you use. It is one potential way of estimating sewer use, but you could take for instance, if you have a park, I'll just, provide a scenario here. Let's say you have a large park and you've got maybe a 3-inch meter, and there is a toilet, maybe a couple of toilets on that park, but by far and large, that water, the majority of that water ends up on a soccer field. That is not a good predictor of water use. That's why we are moving away from charges in proportion to meter size. But there is a capital recovery in the rates that we showed you today. So don't take away that that capital is not being recovered.
We have another question from Dominic Massetti. Please clarify if the Leisure World $2.61 is just an increase in May 2021, and will the 4 subsequent increases be similar until 2025?
I guess I'll take that one. So yes, the 261 is for the first year, But then after that, if you remember in the slide that I showed the revenue increases for water, it went down a little bit every year. So I think it was 14, if I go back to the slide, to the revenue adjustment slide for water, it was 14, 12, 9, 8, 8, 8. So that 2.61 should go down a little bit every year. I don't know exactly what it would be, but if it's 261 the first year, it might be 220 the next year, and then 2 the following. So the increases will go down a little bit every year because sewer is staying the same, remember?
We have a question from Tom Quinn. After the first year and the possible decrease, what is the increase for years 2 to 5?
Well, so sewer would stay the same, and then water would go up in proportion to the slide. If you want to go back to slide 17 is the slide. So that's one way of showing it, is that water would go up 12% in 2022, and then 9, and then 8. The other way of showing that is to go to the water rates that I showed in one of the slides and show how they go up every year. Remember, sewer is staying the same for the next 5 years.
So those are all the written questions that we have. So perhaps we could stick around for a little bit longer to see if any of the attendees would like to submit any further questions for the panelists. We did receive a comment from Mr. David Phillips. Excellent report, and thank you. Thank you, Mr. Phillips, for your comment as well.
If it would be okay while we wait to give a few people an opportunity to submit questions, I'd like to point out a couple of things that may be of interest. We've been going through this report quite extensively since Raftellus completed it. And while some of the information in it has remained static from an assumption perspective, because we had to pick a point in time, the finance department has been watching the trend analysis in both the water fund and the sewer fund over the past 5 years. And we ran an analysis today based on the most recent fiscal year 2021 numbers. And Raftellus's calculations are almost spot on. I mean, a very small percentage deviation when it comes to projecting what the June 30th to 2021 numbers were going to be. We are depleting our cash in the city's water fund. And as we head into the next budget cycle, without these rate increases, it will absolutely be a challenge to continue funding capital improvement projects, particularly in the water fund. We just don't have the reserves. We've dipped into the $6 million range, and by the end of the fiscal year, we will be in the $5 million range. So I know it's a challenge, and I know, I just got a notice from the city that I live in that water rates in my area are likely to increase. And it's not fun, but we want to make sure that we have the capital improvements necessary to ensure the continuation of safe drinking water and to make sure that the city's infrastructure is reliable. And that's really where we need to look at the end of the day, is paying for the capital improvement projects. Right now the rates are, we're in a structural deficit in the water fund. They are not paying for current operations. We have run an operating deficit. When the 2020 financial statements come out, there will be a deficit. And then we're already pacing to have quite a substantial deficit for this fiscal year as well. So, the water rate increase, we need to invest in that capital. And for the sewer rates, while they're going down, a huge piece of it is to balance and have equity amongst all of the ratepayers. That was one of the primary focuses. So if there are questions, outside of this presentation on what some of the numbers look like more currently, reach out to the city's finance department. My email is posted on the finance website, the finance page under the city's website. I'm happy to answer any questions on today's, the current numbers, what we're seeing. Just thought I'd add that little tidbit while we wait for questions.
So we don't have any further comments at this time. So we will be posting tonight's presentation on the city's website by Saturday, February 13th. And we thank you for everybody's attendance and have a good night.
Bye.